For the past several years, the city has been trying to narrow the wage gap for women. More recently, that mission has come to include more attention to inclusion of women in the ranks of leadership, as well as barriers stemming from racism. All of these will be taken up in this year's Effective Practices Conference to be held by the Boston Women's Workforce Council. To give us a preview is the council's executive director, Kim Borman. Thank you very much for being with us, Kim.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
Kim, I want to start with some of the foundation here about the problem that you've been working on. First of all, just the indicators that this problem is real. We're not getting hysterical about anything here. There actually is a very hard data-driven sign of discrimination in terms of the path to leadership and how much money people are making.
Yes, there definitely is. So last year, our 2019 report, which aggregates data from our compact signers, showed that there was a 30-cent difference between what women and men were making in Boston. 30 cents, I mean, that means 70 cents on the dollar. And it's even worse for women of color, which is the disparity is closer to about 55 cents. So we, the Boston Workforce Council, as you said, works with the city of Boston and the employer to strategize on how to eliminate this very real problem of the gender and racial wage gap.
Well, aside from numbers and payroll, you've also done some research around this, even some confidential inquiries, and you got feedback from people. What were they telling you about the climate in the workplace, or maybe the lack of equity in the workplace?
Well, it's interesting. So you're exactly right. You need to look at more than just payroll data, which is very objective and people like because it's metrics based, but there is sort of almost an insidious discrimination that still occurs. And you only get at that through confidential surveys. And we found through our research that the companies that do focus groups or have ways of people to confidentially say, hey, this is what's going on, are able to make a bigger difference in their organizations around that issue in particular.
Well, one of the other problems you're contending with right now is the effect of COVID-19, the economic fallout, because this is, the numbers say it once again, it's coming down more heavily on women. What do you see in Boston, at least?
Well, what we see is what we see overall. I mean, I'm sure you're very aware of the statistics of 825,000 women had left the workforce compared to 225,000 men as of October. And it's just the same in Boston also. You know, COVID has done a couple things. One, it's of course hit essential workers and people who were at a low income area anyway, really hard. And so if you already were one of those people who was not making as much money as a man, and perhaps you and your household had to decide who was going to stay home, you chose yourself because it didn't make as much of a difference. But that takes women out of the workforce. And we're seeing that time and time again. But it's not really only at the low levels or junior levels of workforce. It's at the senior levels too. It's just too much. And people are saying, I can't do it anymore. I think there's somewhat of a silver lining here in the pandemic that people are, I mean, it happened to everyone at one time and we're all noticing it. I mean, I have to tell you, I've been in the workforce for over 30 years. This is not news to me that women are having a hard time juggling everything, especially when their kids are home. And so one thing that has happened is that it's shown a light on it and it's making people much more aware of how this kind of burden hangs on women and keeps them down in the workforce.
Well, there's a tendency to talk about this as being the nature of a given job, that you cannot change it in any way. But are there some cases where employers can change the job so that you don't have this attrition in the workforce?
There are, and there are things that people have talked about for a long time. It really comes down to flexibility and the way that you look at how people handle jobs. I mean, if you can, retention is all around the idea of offering things like paid leave when you need it, working the hours not looking at the hours that you work, but the outcome that you work. So that becomes a part of your evaluation process. It also has to do with offering on-site childcare or subsidies for childcare, which is something actually the city of Boston has really helped with. Is a lot of the childcare businesses have gone out of business because they didn't have any people coming, and they also couldn't open up. So the city of Boston, through the Mayor's Office of Women's Advancement, which is our partner, has given subsidies to a lot of these childcare small mom and pop shops so they can stay open. Those are the things that women need in order to get back into the workforce. So there are a lot of things under this sort of idea of let's be more flexible that can really help during the pandemic.
When we think of a wage gap that's defined by gender, we think of different pay for the same job, according to whether it's held by a man or a woman. But on the other hand, you also want companies and other organizations to look at other kinds of data, even more aggregated data, either company-wide or by gender or by race. What do they learn by doing that that they might not have noticed otherwise?
Well, it's very interesting. It's a really good point. So first of all, people usually think of equal pay for equal work. Well, yes, people should be paid the same for the same job, but that's also been the law since 1963. So it isn't occurring everywhere, but that's really disappointing. I mean, that is something that employers are supposed to be doing right now. So there's this other, and when you look at equal pay for equal work, to your point, we call it an adjusted wage gap. So you're adjusting for education, you're adjusting for experience, but people who have that and are in the same job should be paid the same. And employers need to do the math to look at that. But yes, there is this other half of the equation that is more insidious and probably caused more by discrimination, which has to do with the lack of advancement for women and particularly women of color. And that's when we look at that and we look at those numbers, that is what we call the raw wage gap. You're looking at all men at a company versus all women at a company. And that is when you see this, we talk about the 30 cents. It's because you may be paying all women the same as men in their category of job, but none of them are at the senior level earning the greater salaries. So this gap becomes very wide because there's not enough salaries of women to close it up, to balance it out.
What about pathways to opportunity? Because in a very simplified way, you think you get promoted because you work hard, you show up, and you don't make mistakes. But there's more to it than that. So what kind of things are you looking at?
Well, one of the things that we know works, and we mention it in our study, again, that's going to be out on December 3rd, is the whole idea of sponsorship versus mentorship. People think, oh, I've got a mentor. I've got somebody who's helping me and helping me to figure out how to get around the company and how to do my job. But what women really need they need sponsors. And sponsors tend to be in the leadership of a company. They tend to be people who have clout, and they're people who are not afraid to speak up and say, that person needs an opportunity, that person needs to be promoted. And it's a concept that it's relatively new, but it's very important because it's a real nuance that makes a very big difference in terms of people being promoted in organizations.
Well, some of your recommendations here amount to raising the ante on companies and other organizations, including having a person within the organization who makes this a priority, sets goals, and determines which things are most important. Can you really get companies to do that?
We can. And in fact, I want to celebrate the 250 companies that we have right now doing it. I mean, they're the real heroes. They're the people who have said, and they range in size from large to startups. They want to do whatever they can to close this wage gap. And they've signed what we call the 100% Talent Compact. And when they sign that, they make a pledge. They make a pledge that they will look at their wage gap. They'll do the math and they'll see if they have a wage gap. Many of them think they don't, and then they do the math and they say, whoa, and they have to start putting things in place to change it. They also share their data with us anonymously so that we can aggregate it every 2 years and put out a report which shows a measurement of the wage gap. And then they also participate in sessions, best practice sessions, if you will, with cutting edge research, or they come to the table with things that they have done that have worked, and almost more importantly, that have not worked for them, so that we can start to socialize the things that are important for companies to do.
Well, we should mention that you're having this event coming up. I know that certainly employers should be tuning in, but if anybody else wants to jump on, what's the best way for them to follow up on that?
They should come to our website at bwwc.org and register, and we would love to have them. It'll be a great event.
Well, thank you again very much for taking the time to join us. That was Kim Borman from the Boston Women's Workforce Council.